So here are 7 areas of potential impairment that might take place as a result of developmental trauma. You might recognize some of these in yourself, and it may help explain why that is. Or if you are working with children who have experienced developmental trauma, then this might help you understand some of their presentation. And in this video, we're going to cover quite broadly what these domains are and what's contained within them. And then we can dive into each area in later videos, and we can talk about how to support someone who may be having these difficulties. And let's not forget that children obviously grow into adults. I too once was a child. So although this is generally focused on children and adolescents, because that's where a lot of this research is based, we quite often see these presentations in adults as well, especially if they haven't had any support or help around some of the difficulties in these domains. So I'll try and put up on the screen some screenshots from the literature as I talk. They may look a little wordy, a little bit clinical perhaps, so I'll try to explain them in non-clinical terms as much as I can. And as usual, the references and links will be placed in the description. So firstly, we see problems within the domain of attachment. To a child, arguably the greatest source of danger and unpredictability is the absence of a caregiver who reliably and responsibly protects and nurtures that child. This early caregiving relationship provides the context within which children learn about themselves. They learn about their emotions, they learn about their relationships with others and how they fit in the world. This helps to support the child's development in a lot of key areas, such as being able to regulate their physical states, regulate their emotional states, impacts their sense of safety, so they have a secure base to return to after exploring the environment. And it impacts their early capacity for communication. And this is also where children develop what is often referred to as an internal working model, or a framework, if you will, of how they see the world, how they see other people, and how they and other people fit in it. And this is where you may have heard some of these terms, depending on what modality you come from, depending on what you've read, but terms like core beliefs, terms like schemas, terms like narratives. Okay, they're all kind of the same thing. It's this idea of this template. And over time, these get learned over and over again, and they get reinforced if they keep on happening. As you can probably guess, these experiences influence the way we interact with other people, the way you interact with other people, the way you interact with the world. I don't want this to turn into an attachment theory video, because that's a massive subject in itself, and because we have more than enough to cover in this video and the other domains. But somewhat briefly, there are different attachment styles. We have a style called secure, which some research states is in about 55 to 65% of the population. And that is the result of receptive and sensitive caregiving. This is where the caregiver has responded appropriately to the child's cues and the child's needs. So when the child feels overwhelmed or distressed, lets the caregiver know in some way, probably through a cry, and then the caregiver co-regulates with them to soothe them. The child doesn't know how to do it themselves, so the caregiver does it with them. That's called co-regulation. I still do this with a lot of the adolescents I work with. I co-regulate with them. In fact, there's a lot of adults I've worked with over the years where they've needed some kind of co-regulation because they just haven't known how to do it themselves. And that's not their fault at all. Children are then able to internalize these co-regulation strategies, so they learn what helped, and then they can use them later by themselves. And also the child has a caregiver which can act as a safe base. So the child can go out, it doesn't have to be a child, it could be an adolescent, they can go out, they can explore the world, they can take some risks, they can try things, they can learn. And then if they come across something that is a threat, or something that scares them, or something that makes them anxious, they can return to the safe base for support, for protection, for empathy, for kindness, and for co-regulation if required. It's also said that this builds up qualities like self-compassion, that you're more likely to feel deserving and accepting of love, care, trust, and co-regulation that they are receiving. However, if this relationship, so this relationship between the caregiver or the parent becomes a source of trauma. So if a parent or a caregiver responds uh, to a child in a way that is abusive, that is dismissive, that is rejection, that is shaming, that is threatening, it causes the child fear, or it's disconnected. It's the parent or caregiver is unavailable, or they're unpredictable, or they're incongruent with the child's needs, then this attachment relationship becomes severely compromised. And that's one reason that we start to see the other attachment styles, those attachment styles of avoidant, ambivalent, and disorganized. And if that caregiver is behaving that way, how does the child know that others will or won't respond in the same way? This is a far less secure and safe base to be exploring the world from, as we saw in the secure attachment pattern. And think about the internal working model or the core beliefs that these children might have. The world is unfair and lonely. The world is dangerous and threatening. Relationships are unpredictable. People won't protect me. I am unsafe. I am unlovable. I am nothing. I am a mistake. I am bad. I am worthless. So what happens? Well, this leads to a wide range of difficulties. There's uncertainty about how reliable and how predictable the world is. Some people go on to learn to cope and to protect themselves by pushing others away, keeping others away, and not forming relationships. We also see that this causes difficulties in understanding other people's feelings and other people's intentions and being able to act appropriately in a social context. And children quite often have poorer social judgment, they have lower levels of empathy and have difficulty with perspective taking. And people who come from this sort of background self-report difficulties with things like social rejection. They have poor stranger danger detection. They have inappropriate friendships. They have intense relationships. They have mistrusting relationships. And they can have social withdrawal. So that's the first area. That's attachment. Next, we have the second domain, which is biology. So toddlers or preschool aged children with trauma histories are at risk for failing to develop the brain capacities necessary for regulating emotions in response to stress. So to put that simply, at the risk of dumbing down neurobiology somewhat, trauma interferes with the integration of the left part of the brain and the right part of the brain, such that a child cannot access rational thought in the face of overwhelming emotion. So this leads to children reacting with extreme helplessness, confusion, withdrawal, or rage when stressed. Okay, we can talk about the limbic system, the animal brain, the lizard brain, the brainstem, all of that stuff in a later video. So I'm just going to leave that there for now. And what we see in middle school and adolescence, the most rapidly developing brain areas are those that are crucial for executive functioning and success in forming relationships with other people and for problem solving. Deficits in self-regulatory abilities impede this development, and it leads to difficulties in emotional regulation, in behavior and cognition, in identity formation. We also see in this domain the idea of implicit memories. So these are pre-verbal memories that, while the child cannot later recall and talk about them because they've got no language stored with them, their body has stored the memories in sensory systems. Think about this idea of the body keeps the score, that book by Bessel van der Kolk, which I'm sure you've come across. Now, this can cause what some might refer to as a sensory flashback, where they re-experience the body feeling of immediate danger with no way to make sense of it or be able to communicate it verbally, as the memory has no language attached to it. And we see difficulty with sensory development, which might look like struggling to know how much force to press on things, struggling with certain textures or with certain food and textures of food, struggling with things like balance and coordination, and difficulty knowing whether they are too hot or too cold, difficulty knowing if they are hungry or full up. And then we have emotion regulation. This is the third domain, emotional regulation and emotion expression, which is often impacted within the context of developmental trauma. Usually, children learn these skills in their early childhood, and by around the age of 10 or so, depending on what you read, they know how to notice they are having an emotional reaction. They know what emotion it is that they are experiencing, so they can name it. They can express it in a healthy, clear way, and they can manage the emotion well so that it doesn't take control of them and they can start to make themselves feel calm. We talked about this a bit in the attachment domain, and that is that babies and young children rely on their caregiver to co-regulate. The caregiver responds to the child's emotions and regulates the emotions for them, which teaches them how to respond for themselves later. Then they start to get the message of, my feelings are okay, I can manage these, they're not going to hurt me, people still come to me when I feel this way, and my emotions aren't something to be scared of. And what can happen through developmental trauma is we may see a child that may not have had their own experiences noticed, labeled, or responded to for a variety of reasons. And this doesn't intend to blame the caregiver or parent. There's many, many reasons why this may have happened, and many reasons why the parent or caregiver may have responded in this way. But we are talking about the impacts of this, the impacts of when this does happen. Children struggle with identifying internal emotional experiences. They can't effectively notice the difference between emotions such as happy, excited, scared, anxious, and they can't label them as such because they don't have a framework to do so. They haven't made the connections. That framework most often comes from their caregiver, but if the caregiver doesn't model this well, for example, the child might see a smile from the caregiver, but it's paired with being hurt or rejected. Or if a child is experiencing an upsetting or sad emotion, but they don't know what that is yet, and it's met with an anger response, then the child struggles to interpret what is going on. The child might learn that emotions and feelings are dangerous, and when they feel a certain way, they get hurt in return. Or they might believe their feelings aren't important, or their feelings aren't acceptable, or they're not valid in some way. They might have had to find their own ways to work through these confusing emotions, such as trying to push them down, trying to bottle them up, trying to avoid them, trying to ignore them, trying to distance themselves from these feelings. Maybe it's gone the other way, and instead of trying to shut them out, they've learned that big behaviors like lashing out makes them heard. Maybe it swings between the two, and we end up in a situation where there's this constant activation of the fight, flight, freeze response with no real working coping system in place. It just swings from fight or flight to collapse to freeze. Sometimes this can look like children that are referred to as attention seeking, or are sometimes referred to as being naughty, but that's not really the case. They're trying to communicate in the only way they know how to, and we need to listen to that instead of punishing them for it. And then we move into the fourth domain, which is dissociation. And this is a really big topic. Dissociation comes in many forms and guises, so it's going to warrant its own video at some point. But I like to think of it, generally speaking, as a spectrum that runs from normal kinds of dissociative experiences. So think about getting caught up in a really good book and you don't notice when someone's calling your name because you're just so focused on it, all the way to dissociative disorders such as dissociative identity disorder. And it's thought that dissociation begins as a protective defense mechanism in the face of overwhelming trauma. However, it can sometimes develop into its own disorder that requires its own specific treatment. If we look in the DSM, it identifies specific dissociative disorders such as depersonalization or derealization disorder, dissociative amnesia, and dissociative identity disorder that I mentioned a few moments ago. Imagine a baby or a toddler who is being physically abused by a parent. And whilst that is taking place, so in that specific moment that is taking place, the child cannot fight back. They cannot run away. So fight or flight is unavailable to them. But they can retreat into their own mind to try and protect themselves from the pain. And sometimes this is referred to as psychologically running away. So what dissociation looks like is this separation or a disconnection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviours and memories. This may look like a child remembering a traumatic experience but not having any feelings attached to it. Thinking back to our biology domain, this may look like having a stomachache but having no actual feeling of anxiety underneath it, but there's nothing physically wrong with the child's stomach. There can be flashbacks to memories, to feelings, to behaviours, or to physical pain with no understanding of why they are having that or what has triggered it, because those memories have been fragmented by the dissociation that took place at the time. Imagine how confusing this must be to have these feelings of immediate danger, this sense of impending danger, but not being able to understand why this is happening. And what are other signs of this that we may see when observing a child? It might appear as if the child isn't listening to parents or caregivers or other adults, or at school it might look like daydreaming and lack of focus. There may be rapid regressions to previous states, like suddenly acting like a baby or suddenly seeming very young for their age. And we also know that voice hearing is known as a form of dissociation. It doesn't just happen in serious mental illness like psychosis. So that's also worth keeping in mind. And then we have domain number 5, which is behavioural control. Quite often we see this association with under-controlled behaviour and over-controlled behaviour. So over-controlled are rigidly controlled behaviour patterns, compulsive compliance with adult requests, resistance to changes in routine, rigid control of food intake, or hoarding behaviour, or under-controlled behaviour such as aggression and what is sometimes diagnosed as conduct disorder or oppositional defiance disorder. We may see behaviours that represent children's defensive adaptations to overwhelming stress, such as reenacting behavioural aspects of their trauma through aggression, or through sexualised behaviour, or through self-injurious behaviours. Because there might be a lack of coping skills, we might see drug or alcohol use to avoid feeling distressing emotions. And because there might be difficulty in knowing how to form or understanding healthy relationships, we might see sexual behaviours as a way to try and achieve acceptance and intimacy. This is also where we often see this idea of window of tolerance being used. So when a child is in their window of tolerance, they find that their inner world and their outer world are quite tolerable, they're bearable, and they are in more of a position to think and to learn and to relax and to have fun. However, for traumatized children, they quite often have a really narrow window of tolerance, and quite often small things can push them outside of that window, where they become either hyper aroused, so hyper meaning too much, so too much arousal, so you might see running away, fighting, hitting, screaming, shouting, biting, saying horrible things, avoiding things that might be seen as disruptive behaviors. These are all fight-flight behaviors that they are doing to try and get away from the perceived threat, so they can bring themselves back into their window of tolerance. Or they can become hypo-aroused, hypo meaning not enough, beneath or below. And what we might see here are children feeling numb, children feeling dead inside, children zoning out, feeling empty, that have difficulty in connecting with others and difficulty thinking clearly. These are those collapse type behaviors you sometimes hear about in the fight, flight, freeze, collapse framework. Then we have domain number 6, which is cognition. And in children, especially children who have had abusive and neglectful caregivers, then that deprivation of sensory and emotional needs appears to really impact cognitive development. By early childhood, neglected children demonstrate less flexibility and creativity in problem-solving tasks. Children and adolescents demonstrate deficits in attention and abstract reasoning. By early elementary or primary school, neglected children are more frequently referred for special education needs. We see lower grades and lower academic achievement. We see higher rates of dropout from education. And as time goes on, this widens. We see this widening effect between their peers, because as they meet critical points in their lives and in their development, they don't have the foundations to build upon. Having said that, and this is why all of this can get a bit hard to unpick, we sometimes see the other side of this, where children appear bright, they appear focused and achieve well academically. Well, those children might actually be preoccupied with success and achievement because they feel that being seen and being loved is dependent on those outcomes. but quite often they really struggle with emotional literacy. So difficulty with articulating emotions and making decisions about their lives, as we've seen in the other domains. And now we move on to domain number 7, and this is self-concept. So if you expose a child to repeated forms of verbal abuse from people who should be there to look after them, such as, "You ruined my life, you're nothing to me," and they've shamed or blamed that child, or being rejected, neglected, and having emotional needs minimized, or having limited or conditional opportunities to be or to feel appreciated, praised, or receive positive attention, and spending large amounts of time in survival mode and having a disconnect between your thoughts, your feelings, and your body and your memories, then it's quite easy to think that this will have an impact on self-identity or self-concept, how you see yourself. There is a quote, and I'm not sure who originally said it, so I apologize if they happen to watch this and I haven't been able to credit you, but it's, "If you abuse, abandon, or neglect a child, the child doesn't stop loving the parent, they stop loving themselves." And that's what I see in my practice. Children often end up with this sense of being bad or this sense of being unwanted. And that then becomes their template of how they see themselves fitting within the world, even once they've moved on from that caregiver. And it doesn't matter how much you try to tell them that they aren't bad or that they are wanted, they really struggle to connect with that, to make a genuine emotional connection with what you are saying. This then has issues that come with it, such as being vulnerable to exploitation, not knowing what group they belong with, not even knowing things like what they really like, what they enjoy, what they want to do. And that's in the present moment or the very, very, very near future, like tomorrow. Never mind trying to think about future plans like after education. So something that you might have noticed is that there is a massive overlap between some of these domains and the presentations within those domains and other diagnoses or other disorders or other presentations. And it can be really difficult to pick them apart. So coming up, I'm going to make some videos about the overlap between trauma and ADHD, trauma and ASD, trauma and personality disorder, and how we can try and tease apart what's going on. Because a lot of those presentations we talked about in those domains, whilst they can be attributed to trauma, that's not always the case. You do get non-traumatized children who present in that way for different reasons. And I say this because people quite often come to me as someone who specializes in trauma, expecting me to always attribute everything to trauma because that's my main lens of looking at things. But that's not the case. I have quite an open mind when it comes to people's presentations. And I think a good history, a good assessment, decent functional analysis will get us to know what's going on for that child or what's going on for that person, what their template is. And then we can help support them as best as we can. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure if I explained that last bit well enough, but I'm hoping you know what I mean. Thanks for watching. If you think this is helpful, then please consider subscribing to the channel. Let's help it grow. Let's help get this information out there. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.